open it up and then full screen, and then pause it on top. And then yeah, and one second.
Good afternoon. Today we have Marianna Yamamoto, Professor Yoon, Professor Grant, and Professor G. Okay. Professor Yoon is an assistant professor of sociology at Sonoma State. Professor Yoon has received a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign before joining the faculty at SJW. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Her ongoing study investigates changes in patterns of and determinants of transition to adulthood over time in South Korea. Using data from 1990 and 2010 Korean census, her research compares the transition to adulthood among Korean young adults over the last 2 decades, focusing on gender and socioeconomic differentials in that transition. As a sociologist and social demographer, her primary research and teaching interests lie in the areas of family, gender equality, and population change. The research focused on the theoretical importance of work and family balance through achieving gender equality as a determinant of family demography. Using large panel survey data sets or micro-level census data, her work aims to improve the understanding population changes and their micro and macro level determinants, generating insights to inform theory as well as decision makers in the areas of public policy and members of the general public. Professor Willie joined faculty at Sonoma State in the fall of 2018. He received his doctorate in political science from the University of Pennsylvania and has previously taught at Xavier University of Louisiana. His research focuses primarily on the racial and ethnic politics, technology, and politics, inequality, and American political development. Marianna Yamamoto is NALEO Educational Funds of California Census Program Coordinator, where she supports the statewide 2020 census campaign. I am glad I said that. Okay. I'm sorry, I really messed it up. To promote a full and accurate count of the Latino population. Marianna builds partnerships with community-based organizations and leaders across the state to educate, engage, and activate Latino community members and to respond to the 2020 census. Prior to joining NALEO Educational Fund, Marianna worked for Asian American Advancing Justice LA's Health Access Project, coordinating efforts to increase access to quality health coverage and care of Asian American, Native American, or Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and immigrant communities in California. Her advocacy work has focused on the Medi-Cal dental program, language accessibility, and cultural competency of healthcare and public change. Marianna is a proud first-generation Japanese and Venezuelan American woman raised in West Michigan and the United Kingdom, and a graduate from University of Michigan. Professor Grant is worked in criminal justice department for 20 years. She is committed to social change and inclusivity of everyone. She's also an old San Franciscan that loves turtles.
Should I get us started? Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here and to be part of this panel, so thank you very much for extending the invitation. My name is Marianna Yamamoto, and I'm with NALEO Educational Fund. NALEO stands for the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. We're a membership organization that's nationwide and provides an opportunity for elected and appointed officials to work together. In addition to that, I'm part of NALEO Educational Fund, which is the 501c3 arm of NALEO, and there we are really working to ensure the full participation of Latinos in the American political process. And part of our work really stems in 3 different areas. The first one is constituency services, where we're really supporting our elected officials and members who are part of NALEO with professional development and things like that. In addition to that, we do policy research and advocacy, where we're able to look at issues that are taking place on the federal and state level and respond to them, and bringing the Latino voice into those spaces. And the last team that is part of NALEO Educational Fund is the Civic Engagement Team, which is what I'm a part of. And there we're working from everything from citizenship and naturalization services all the way to census, as they're all part of the pillars of our democracy and in ensuring that our Latino communities are able to participate. So we're here to talk about the census today, and so there's a lot. I'm sure my panelists will, I imagine that we'll be going through this as well, but I think one of the big things and the reasons why NALEO Educational Fund has such a priority in working on the census, not only on census years, but in the 10 years leading up to the census, and even following the census and figuring out what the best practices are and strategies in order to ensure a fair and accurate count is really a huge part of our work. And it's not just the activity of having a census and getting everyone counted, but it's really what that data is used for, which is what's important, right? And why we place so much emphasis on the census. And really, when I talk about the census, it really boils down to the distribution of power, the distribution of money, and how we're protecting our civil rights as well. So if we don't know how many folks are living here and who's living in the US, it's really hard to be able to make really informed decisions of these three things. And one of the things that when I talk to community about the census that really resonates with folks tends to be this part about community resources, right? Since we're all paying taxes, this is one way that we get our taxpayer money back. Maybe it's not in the form of a check or $100 that comes back into my wallet, but it comes in the form of these resources that are available for our families to be using. So one of the ways that we like to talk about the census and how this count happens is the Census Bureau's hard to count index, right? So how they determine which populations and how to strategically ensure that there's a full count. And one of the important things that we like to emphasize is that it's really not that these communities are hard to count, but that they've been historically undercounted. That there's not anything wrong with the communities that have been undercounted, but that the way in which the census is conducted has made it more difficult or less difficult for certain folks to participate. And some of this has been a really big thing that we've been seeing in historically undercounted communities, especially among our Latino communities, our Asian American, our Asian and Pacific Islander communities, our Native American communities. And some of the things here you see here are just some examples of the populations that have been historically undercounted. So one of the really big things and one of the huge reasons why we have our Hazme Contar campaign within NALEO Educational Fund, which Hazme Contar means make me count from the perspective of a child, is that in 2010 we saw a net undercount of 1 million children. And of those 1 million children, 400,000 of them were Latino children. So we see this as a huge priority for our Latino communities. Even within California, we had 210,000 children ages 0 to 4 who were missed in 2010, 113 of them to be Latino kids. So this is why NALEO Educational Fund has placed a lot of emphasis in ensuring a full count of our communities in its entirety, including our kids. And a lot of the same reasons in which that have impacted the undercount of community members in past censuses also impact the undercount of children. So that's, folks who, kids who live in multi-generational households or multi-unit households, kids who live in households with limited English speaking ability or low income households, all of these factors are impacting the general population, but especially this count of young children. So I wanted to touch a little bit on why this 2020 census, how it's impacting Latinos, and specifically some of the opportunities as well as challenges that exist with the 2020 census. And so I think when talking about this, we really saw in leading up to the 2020 census there was a underfunding of the Census Bureau, right? And these efforts that that affected the planning, right, and implementation of how the census was done. And so that led to, one, the addition of the internet option as a way in which folks could respond. It's a common, you might hear it in the media and things that this is the first digital census, but this is also, there's also additional ways to respond to the census. It's not a digital only census. And while we're in the most like internet savvy, tech savvy times of our nation, it also, that provides a great opportunity. It also provides a lot of challenges when it comes to reaching our communities. We still have many areas that have limited broadband access, or folks who might not have access to devices or might not be comfortable using a device, which poses as a challenge, especially among our Latino communities. The second piece that I thought would be really important to touch on is the Hispanic origin or Latino origin question that's on the census. And this has been something that has that we've placed a lot of attention to leading up to this. So there's a question on the census that asks, are you of Latino or Hispanic origin? And it goes through a number of options, yes, no, and then also provides an opportunity for folks to self-identify a specific origin. This data has been fought for by our past and present Latino advocates in order to ensure that key civil rights policies are enforced. So that includes our voting rights, ensuring fair employment or health care, and important at identifying disparities and addressing needs. So one of the things that we saw in leading up to this census was that the Census Bureau had done actually quite a bit of research around how best to ask this question, both the question on Hispanic or Latino origin as well as on race. There was a lot of advocacy to actually combine these two questions to help with response rates, and in addition to add in additional identities that have been left out in the past. And one of those is the MENA category, the Middle Eastern North African category that previously has not existed and has not been recognized on the 2020 census. Unfortunately, that was something that was struck down and scrapped by the Census Bureau right before the questions were finalized. But this is a really big area for our Latino communities because we find a lot of folks answer that first question, are you Latino, Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Folks may say yes. And then when asked, what is this person's race? Folks are saying, I already told you. Like, I already told you I'm Mexican. I've already told you I'm Venezuelan. Why are you asking me this again? So folks really aren't seeing themselves reflected in this second question, which causes people to either skip the question altogether and leave it blank, which would require the Census Bureau to follow up with these family members or these individuals, or folks clicking some other race and writing in a specific saying that they're Latino there. And so it's projected in the 2020 census that some other race will be the second largest racial category in the US. And something that I'm sure will come up in conversation today was the untested citizenship question and the attempt to add it. We were very fortunate that there was a lot of advocacy that went into this, both as it was going through the proposal stages and as it went through the Supreme Court, so that it was actually blocked from being added to the 2020 census, but this still continues to pose a risk to the willingness and ability for folks to have confidence in responding to the census. So I wanted to highlight a few pieces, and I won't go too much into detail around these, but one of the big things in preparing for our census campaign, what that NALEO Educational Fund did was to actually do message research because we needed to really understand what our Latino community members would respond to and what messages would really resonate to folks as we were embarking on this work. And one of the things that we saw was really that folks were understood the basics of the census, and that we were needing to do more education around some of the nitty-gritty details, like how do I respond online, or what are the ways in which I can respond to the census given the changes that were happening. In addition to that, the willingness to participate that we saw from our respondents, we also saw these concerns which we might imagine exist. Things like, is the census website secure from hackers or from the data in that sense? How will this information be used by the administration, and will it impact immigrants or Latinos? Also, there was a lot of confusion on whether or not the census would ask if someone was a US citizen. So that continues to be a point of concern and confusion for our community members. And just this hesitancy of giving any personal information to a government agency. So some of the key pieces that we found that I really want to lift up is that in 2018, we heard from our community members that reinforcing that the census was convenient, safe, and required was really powerful, and just reiterating that message. And in addition to that, we've recently heard more from community members that this empowerment message of saying, hey, stand up, be counted, make yourself heard, is also very much resonating with folks. And in addition to that, being able to talk about what the census does and what the data does in the sense of bringing funding, bringing resources back into the community was something that was very powerful for our community members. Knowing that we were doing this not just for ourselves, but also for our families and for our neighbors, and that this would benefit all of us as a whole. And I think it's important to note that it was, just telling someone it's safe, isn't enough to get folks to respond, but it was really important that we reinforce these messages with facts, saying it's convenient, safe, and required because we have federal laws that protect our data, that protect our privacy, and making this safe to participate. Or saying the Supreme Court ruled that the citizenship question wouldn't be added and was reinforced by lower courts. So that's why it's safe to participate. So it's really important to back those things up with fact. Just some quick recommendations was that really we need to be educating our community members about the questionnaire itself, what's being asked, what's not being asked, and who counts, and reinforcing that we're really wanting everyone to count. Really making sure that we're doing intentional and targeted outreach to our communities, whether that is the Latino community or Asian American communities or African American communities, just being very intentional and strategic in our communication. Another piece was really not politicizing the census. I think it has been very much politicized, but I think one of the things that we hear is that among Latino community members, the Census Bureau is actually thought of as separately from the Trump administration. So using that to our advantage of saying, hey, the Census Bureau really just wants to know, they just want to know the statistics, right? That there's nothing political about it, was a really important thing that we learned there. And the last thing I'll mention here is using our trusted messengers, right? So we really heard from community members that it's our Latino organizations, it's our family members, it's our teachers and people who speak for the children, our providers, so nurses, doctors, folks like that, who are really the trusted people to carry out this message and help us in these efforts. So I'll just speak through these, is that we, in the 2020 census, we really hold 3 roles. We are a national partner of the Census Bureau. This is our CEO, Arturo Vargas's 4th census, and as an agency, this is our 3rd census, so we've been very involved over decades. In addition, we're the census's #1 cheerleader. We really want to see this to be a success, but also bring accountability, right? So we are going to help the Census Bureau out as much as possible, but we will keep them accountable to ensure confidentiality, to ensure that we're able to get a fair count. And some of the ways in which we do this is through our campaigns. So the Haga Se Cuenta campaign, which means make yourself count, right? So how we're bringing these different resources and information to our communities, but also to our community partners, right? So why reinvent the wheel? If we have, if we're able to develop messaging together or have these fact sheets, resources and things that we can all share, help so that we can have collective capacity to get the word out. And that's the same thing with our Haz Me Cuenta campaign, specifically targeting children ages 0 to 5, and supporting our educators and parents. And then one of the big things is our hotline that we have launched. And this is a huge strategy for 2020, where we have a bilingual hotline for anyone to call in and ask any questions or raise any concerns around the census. And we would be able to help direct folks in the right direction. And our campaign is nationwide as well as locally, and being able to bring these resources, trainings, and capacity building to various states across the country. We also have a lot of swag. There's like some t-shirts in the back and things like that, so I invite folks to take a look. In addition to some really great graphics and social media work, I think one priority that we see is engaging our Latina millennials for this campaign. And I think this is a really awesome campaign that I see myself in, which is really great. And so this is something that's available. I'll put this up here just to provide, as folks think about like ways that you can participate in the census. These are some of the key dates that you can consider as you're thinking about how to engage. And then the last piece is ways to get involved. There's a number of different places where folks can be sharing out this information, whether that's among friends, whether that's among family. As you go home for spring break, you could be asking about the census and reminding your family members or friends about it. And also there's census jobs available. So if you're looking for something in a way to get involved, that is one really big opportunity where we want to stress that it's important for our enumerators to be from the community, have cultural competency and linguistic competency. And that's all I have for today. Hopefully I stayed on time. Okay. Now that's our, they're the AV computer. Yeah. Okay. I have. And who was the last one? I didn't have any go. Great.
My name is Yeon, assistant professor of sociology at SJW. Today I'm going to talk about sources of error, how to count all the people in the state correctly, and then I'm going to focus on especially the issues related to Sonoma County and state of California. So your county wants everyone to be counted in the census. Sonoma County has their own website for census, Marin County has it, Napa County has it, all the county want everyone to be counted in the census because they want to represent our communities fairly. So fair representation of the resources and where money goes to. So that's why a lot of counties really emphasize the importance of participating in census. So why does census matter? It started in 1790 and it's required by the US Constitution. So everyone in the United States are required to participate in by law. and it counts the entire population of a country. And important thing is at the location where each person usually lives. So this is related to the potential sources of error, how to count the population correctly and accurately. So it is related to the fair representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. So how many seats go to which state. And it actually also benefits our community. That's why all the counties want everyone to be counted. Because based on the U.S. Census data, a lot of federal funds, for example, there were about 316 federal funds program that is distributed to 50 states based on the 2010 census data. So all the monies are based on the U.S. Census data, so that's why every county really emphasizes the importance of participating in that process. So for example, the local communities and governments, they get money from the federal government in terms of the affordable housing, health services, and school district, etc. So there are many ways that we can think about. So this slide shows selected federal assistance distributed to each state using the Census Bureau data based on 2016 fiscal year. So there were around a total of 316 federal programs, and they have about 55 biggest federal programs that use the census data. So based on all the monies from the federal government, because California is the biggest state based on the population as well as the money-wise. The state of California, they received about 13% of the all money from the federal government, followed by New York, 8%, Texas, 7%, Florida, 5%, Pennsylvania, 4%, Illinois, 4%. These are 6 biggest states in the US, and the rest of 44%, 44 other states, they received 59% of the total money that was distributed from the federal government. So the big chunk of the money goes to Medicaid, about half of them will go to Medicaid, and then these are one of the kind of biggest assisted federal program for each state. And the last one, I would like to highlight the importance of the last one, Fire Management Assistance Grant, given that in recent years, we have wildfires in 3 past years, so this is really important for us to be counted because it matters for the state and local government. So census data is very useful and important, especially when it comes to disaster with preparedness and emergency plan. So information about how many people live in the town and where they live is critical for emergency response because they can help, the data can help them to identify distribution points for supplies and direct people to shelters in other counties so they can map out capacity of each shelters in county and other areas. And they also plan evacuation routes. If they have just one route that has really high congestion, that way they can plan, build more roads, other infrastructure. So that's why really important, especially for the state of California, this emergency plan. And census there are several kind of potential sources of error. The biggest one is coverage error, which is covered by the first presenter a little bit. So some group of people are more likely to be represented, but some group of people are less likely to be underestimated or undercounted. So there are 2 different types, but it's much more problematic and serious error because related to undercoverage, undercounted population. So for example, in 2010 census, overcounted folks it varies by race and ethnicity. So white non-Hispanic residents are overcounted by 0.8%. But other racial minorities, for example, Black population were undercounted by 2.1%, and Hispanic population were also undercounted by 1.5%. Also, it varies by other socioeconomic status. So about undercounted the number of renters by 1.1%, and less educated and lower income are less undercounted compared to highly educated and homeowners. So it matters because this characteristic of undercovered or overcovered housing units or individuals very different. And that's why census may not provide an accurate picture of the population. So the census developed an index which is they called hard to count index, and they have about 4 main types of hard to count groups: hard to locate, hard to contact, hard to persuade, and hard to interview. So these 4 types are not mutually exclusive, so that means some group of people can be applicable all these 4, but some group only applicable to 1. So especially some group of people who can apply to all these 4 main types can be more, much more likely undercounted compared to other groups. And that if that's the case, it skews the demographic estimates of its population by state and by communities, and it relates to underrepresentation within government, and it leads to inefficient allocation of public and private resources. So one of the things that state of California needs to consider is counting California's homeless population, because California has the largest share of homeless population in the state, in the nationwide. So there are about 130,000 people living in shelters or outdoor in the state of California, and that's by far large share compared to other states. So in 2020 census, they have some strategies to count these people. For example, they will count people outdoors or other locations that are known to where they sleep usually. And then they work with service providers and service location, for example, traditional shelters, soup kitchens, mobile food vans, and they will also count at park and other tent cities. So they have other kind of strategies to count these people. That is also critical, especially in the state of California. So this is a map of the state of California by the US Census. There are several parts of the state that are known to be undercounted communities in California. So the dark red means it's really hard to find compared to other communities. And based on 2010 census, when their NALEO response rate is less than 73%, they identify this as undercounted communities. So California has about 30% at the time, but looks like it has a lot of the areas show really high, hard to count index. So here I'd like to highlight, especially in Sonoma County. So this is a map of the Sonoma County, California, and there are specific areas that US Census identifies hard to count communities. So let's take a look at this one. So based on census tract, so it's included in city of Santa Rosa, Sonoma County, that has really high hard to count index as of 72, which is pretty high. So one of the hard to count index based on 14 different factors, and out of 14 different factors, these 3 are most leading characteristic in the city of Santa Rosa in this census tract. That's non-family household, because non-family household, they can miss their roommate because that's not really, if they're not really close, right? And then multi-unit structure, 60% of the residential buildings are multi-unit structure, for example, condo and apartments. That way, it's really hard for census to count every single person in that structure. And then it's highly renter-occupied units. So about 73% of all the residents are renters, which is traditionally known to be undercounted population. And then, so think about the four main categories, how to count. So traditionally, foreign-born population are less likely to be counted compared to native-born. So the population in Santa Rosa is about nearly 30% of them are foreign-born, and under 5 years old, 8%, and with income below 150% of poverty rate, which is 30%, which is pretty high. And age 25 or older without a high school diploma makes up 33%. So all these factors contribute to this area. It's hard to count community in Sonoma County. And the top language spoken at home, Spanish, makes up nearly 97%. So we need a census taker who can speak Spanish so that way they can communicate and contact people there. And then another source of error in census is the information they collect. So these are all the type of information that represent the household level, and they ask 7 questions for everyone in the household. Name, sex, age, birthday, Hispanic or Latino origin, race, relationship to the person filling out the form, lastly, other residents. So, as the previous speaker already covered, Hispanic and Latino origin and race are 2 different things. That increases a lot of confusion when people filling out the survey. Not survey, filling out the census. So how to answer this question about race and ethnicity? So Hispanic or Latino is a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American or other Spanish culture or origin regardless of race. So the US Census does not identify Hispanic or Latino as a type of race. Instead, so any person who identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish may be any race. That's why people are asked to check their Hispanic origin first, and then the second question, let us know your race. And how Americans view race and ethnicity differently also than in the past, and their view is very different from the census perspective. And they inserted the last one, which is some other race. The intention to have this some other race from the census perspective, this should be kind of minor group, which has a really small portion. But in fact, that was the 3rd largest race group in 2000 and 2010 censuses. And as the estimate shows, it can be the 2nd largest group in 2020 census. That is largely because Hispanic and Latino population, they identify their race as Mexican or Puerto Rican and under some other race instead of choosing other race. And African, Caribbean, and Middle Eastern, from the census perspective, they can check white, but a lot of Middle Eastern people, they say they're and North African. So in 2020 census, for the first time, if one person say white, and then for the first time, they can also identify their specific ethnicity. German, French, Irish for the first time, and Black folks as well. So this is a kind of that census tried to do new thing to identify their origin more specifically. And actually, census call us very differently. So if we see a historical timeline in 1790, when the first U.S. Census was conducted, there are only 3 categories. So 3 white males, 3 white females, all other 3 persons slave. There are only 3 options. In 1930, that was the first and the last census that has Mexican as race. So they allowed to have Mexican as own race. That was a single time. And then they deleted that option, and then ever since, we still do not have that option. So that's where also confusion comes from, and then that leads to, yeah, sources of error in census data. And this is all. Yeah. Thank you. Not that I'm just trying to volunteer everybody, but you guys have your stuff. You have your flag right now.
All right, so my name is Willie Jin. I'm an assistant professor here in political science, and I just want to thank Diana Grant for organizing the panel and thank my co-participants, because it's always great to hear outside your discipline, to hear what's the view from actual organizations that are doing something about these things that us professors just think about abstractly, and also to hear from other disciplines like sociology, who have definitely a different view than, say, the type of concerns that we think about when we're in our own silos in political science. Diana asked me to talk about the political effects of the census, and I thought I'd start off by talking about something that probably we all thought about this weekend, which is the coronavirus. Now, here I would like to call this the parable of China and the coronavirus. We know that the coronavirus started in early December in a province in China, and yet it was only until January 20th that the leader of China, Xi Jinping, started to admit, okay, yeah, we have a problem going on here that has resulted in a huge public policy failure where you have 700 million people in China who are under some kind of mobility restriction because they let this virus get out of control. Now, why does this matter for discussion about the census? Well, what I think how it relates and why I'm calling this a parable is because it's an information problem. If we're not getting accurate data from people on the ground, then our leaders are not going to be able to act appropriately in order to contain something that is a huge problem for all of us. And now this has become a global problem. And I had to rush to buy my hand sanitizer last Thursday, and now it's all gone. So when we're formulating public policy, there has to be a willingness of people to give accurate data, and there has to be a willingness of the government to listen to accurate data. And if any parts of those equation falls apart, then we could have huge public policy failures, as we've seen with the coronavirus. So I think we can start to see how that relates to the census, because the census is all about getting accurate data about our people so that we can solve big public policy problems. Now, this next slide I'm showing, does anybody know what I'm showing here? Nobody? This is the Incan way of recording data. So they use what they call the kipu, the tie knots, to record how many people are in a particular area, what's their wealth, what do they have. So we can see that censuses are as old as the foundation of large societies, like the Incan society back in the 1500s and 1600s. And counting people is a formative element of how you try to manage a large and complex society. And we don't have to think about this as, we can think of very simple examples of this in our everyday lives. If you're planning a wedding, what is the first thing you do? You send out RSVPs because you need an accurate count in order to plan a good party. So it applies to our parties, it applies to whatever ancient society we want to think about. We have to record accurate information about who we're dealing with. Now, this imperative to record the numbers of population is even more important in a democracy. Here we see that one of the very first paragraphs in the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, one of the very first things they talk about is we need to take a census. We need to count the people. That's how important they thought it was. They put it right up there at the beginning of the US Constitution. Now, if we just read this sentence, I know, it's a sunny day and I'm reading to you from the US Constitution, but it's important because as we've learned from our other presenters, it matters who counts and who are counted. So what is the US Constitution says? First, it says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers. So that already tells you something that's really important. The purpose of the census, especially for a democratic society, is to apportion representation, our representatives to Congress, and also how we spend the taxes that the federal government collects. That's right there in the very first sentence. Now, there's some other interesting things in this passage from the Constitution. Who are we counting? It says, it shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. So the people we need to count are not just citizens. They're not just people who can vote. You know how many people actually voted to ratify the US Constitution? 1 out of 6 males. Less than 16% of our population actually, of our male population at that time, actually voted. But we don't just want to count them. We need to count everybody because, again, using our party planning example, we have to take into account everybody in order to accurately implement public policy. So we have to count everybody, not just the voters. We have to count women, non-voting men, men who didn't have property, so they weren't eligible to vote at that time, which was 5/6 of men at that time, and also children. Now, the other interesting thing about this passage that we're reading from the Constitution, sure. Okay, all right. The other thing that's interesting about this little constitutional law lecture I'm doing right now is the last part. Who should we count? So we should count the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years. So we're counting indentured servants at this time as well. But we should exclude Native Americans, not taxed, Indians, not taxed, and also we should only count 3/5 of all other persons. Now, you probably remember from your American history or American civics class, this is the infamous 3/5 clause where we're going to count slaves as each slave is going to count as 3/5 in terms of apportionment of legislators. So what does this tell us? This also tells us that the census is inherently a political exercise. The South, they wanted their slaves to count, even though they couldn't vote. They wanted them to count because it would give the South more representation. The non-slave holding states in the North, they didn't want the slaves to count at all. So there was a political compromise where they said, okay, we'll count them as 3/5, and then Southern states will get some extra political representation. So this tells us that the census is not just this neutral exercise where we're just counting people, but also sometimes the decisions by the elites in our society can make decisions that affect how we're going to divvy up representation in the United States. All right, now my other presenters have talked a lot about why the 2020 census matters, and I just want to expand on some of those points by giving some examples. So really, I can think of 4 really important reasons why the 2020 census matters. One, we were talking about how do we divvy up legislators? Second, how do we divvy up federal funds? Marianna talked about we need the census because this is how we enforce our civil rights. So I want to expand a little bit on that as well. And then finally, the census also matters even if you're not the government. If you're just a business who wants to come up with a business plan, you need good data in order to figure out, well, where should I locate my business? So I want to just briefly go into some of these different aspects of why the census matters. First, it matters for how we divvy up legislators. Now, here you see a map showing population change from 1970 to 2008. And we see that some states are losing population and other states are gaining population. We see the sort of orange and red and dark red color. Those are areas that are gaining population. The sort of lighter blue areas are places that are losing population. Now, just as a matter of democracy, if we want one House member to represent every 700,000 people, then we have to take account population movement. So we want to give the areas that are gaining population more representation, and we want to give the areas that are losing population less representation. I think everyone would agree that's fair, right? That's just something we should do. And over time, from 1970 to 2010, you see that as we take into account population change, some areas are gaining members in the House of Representatives. So we've gained 10 House of Representative members in California because people want to come here for the sunshine. Marianna's visiting from Los Angeles and she's driving through Sonoma and she's like, yeah, it's kind of nice out here. Maybe we can convince her to come to Sonoma. So people want to live where the weather is nice or where there's job opportunities. Marianna, she'll look at the housing prices in California, in Sonoma, and then she'll probably say, stay where I am. Okay, so that's why Texas is increasing, because we see with Fixer Upper, you can get like nice property for $200,000 that you can't get here. So, just as a matter of fairness, population is changing. We want to rearrange the number of legislators that each area gets. Now, this doesn't apply just at the federal level. It also applies at the state level as well. Certain counties within California are gaining population, like around Riverside or around Sacramento. Other areas are losing population. So even within our California state legislature, we want to reapportion legislators to match where the population is so that there's fairness. Now, sometimes this apportionment can go wrong. Here's an example of how apportionment might go wrong within a state. Just as a matter of policy, the census records prisoners as residents in the counties where they're being incarcerated. Now, why does that matter? It matters because the majority of our prisons are now in rural areas. But the majority of the people incarcerated are actually coming from urban areas. And so that leads to an imbalance in the political power between rural areas and urban areas. If we're counting people who were removed from cities who are incarcerated in rural areas, if we're counting them as members of those rural areas, then suddenly we're giving more political representation to those rural areas, and we're losing political representation in more dense urban areas. So you would lose representation and you potentially lose funding within your state. Okay, so apportionment, that's the first big reason why we should care about the Census 2020. The other big reason is been touched upon a lot by my other commentators. So I'll just go through it quickly. As So Yoon mentioned, we have over 300 federal programs that divvy out $1.5 trillion in money to the states. And how they allocate this money is based on very complex formulas, but sometimes it's just based on number of residents, sometimes it's based on per capita income. And any of those ways of allocating money, often you just need accurate census statistics to calculate those variables correctly. A lot of federal programs are meant to help the poor, right? How do we determine which areas are poor? We need a count of per capita income. How do we calculate per capita income? Well, it's money divided by population. If population is wrong in the denominator, then our calculation of per capita income is wrong. So those complex formulas all depend on accurate census statistics. Marianna mentioned that that census is important for civil rights enforcement, and I want to give some examples of that. So historically, in 1870, the census had a really unique question. The question was, are you a male 21 or over who has had your voting rights been as restricted? Seems like an odd question for the census to ask, right? Nowadays we ask age, sex, race, ethnicity. Why in 1870 were they asking people, have you had your vote abridged? Do you have an answer in the back? We just fought a ruinous civil war. We passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which now abolishes slavery, establishes equal protection for everybody under the law, and guarantees the voting rights of the freed slaves, right? So how do we know our voting rights, the 15th Amendment is being implemented correctly? Let's ask the free population, has your voting rights been restricted? This was a way to monitor, are we actually enforcing the 15th Amendment correctly? And then we could see, maybe there are areas where they're not voting, and then we could target public policy towards alleviating that. So we can compare that with a country like France. France has decided, as a matter of public policy, they're just not going to collect any racial or ethnic statistics. They will just not ask. They conceive of themselves, we're all Frenchmen. Now, how are we going to measure if there's racial inequality in France, if we don't even know how many people of different ethnicities and races there are in France? So that could be a huge problem. Now, here we're talking about social justice issues this entire week, and all of the basic questions we can ask about social justice relies on just knowing how many African Americans are there in a particular area, how many Asian Americans are there, how many Latinx Americans are there. So if we think about simple questions like, how segregated are we? Are people of color underrepresented in occupations? Are people of color voting at their population rates? What's the level of inequality in society? All of those basic questions of social justice we are thinking about this week, you need to have data to actually answer those questions. And that's why, thank you for coming on a sunny day to actually think about the boring topic of numbers and counting and government, because it's actually really important. Now, even if you don't care a lick about social justice, maybe you're just one of those free market capitalist types, you still need census data to actually run a business. How are you going to tell what consumers there are in a particular market? How are we going to tell what type of workers there are in a particular market? You need data for that. So if you want to expand your franchise of, whatever, In-N-Out. How do I know there's a market for In-N-Out in Sonoma? We need to have data. So even if you don't even care about social justice, you should care about the census, because that's how businesses make decisions. That's called market research. They need census data. All right, now, from the very beginning of our political history, we've had problems with counting. We've undercounted certain people. So George Washington, he said, whoa, we just had our first census in 1790, and we didn't get everybody. So they were even having problems in 1790, and he suggested some reasons why people weren't participating. He said the religious scruples of some would not allow them to give in their list. So one reason why people might not participate is because they fear oppression. Religious minorities, they're unsure about what's the government going to do with this data, so they just don't want to give any information at all. So that they won't get oppressed. Other people, the fear of others was that the census was intended as a foundation of attacks. So they distrusted government. The last reason, he says, some people were just indolent. And in modern terms, we might just say they just lacked a sense of civic obligation. It's our civic obligation to stand up and be counted. Otherwise, we can't plan the party correctly, right? Now, Yoon studies surveys, and one thing I'm sure she knows is that survey participation is increasingly getting worse, right? And that applies to the census as well. Participation in the census on the first attempt to try to contact people has been declining over time. In the past, they sent you a mail form, and then you're supposed to respond. The response rate has been declining over time. And that applies to just surveys in general. And so that's making the census more expensive to conduct. People aren't responding on the first try, so we have to send in people on the ground to try to contact them. And that becomes expensive. So over time, the cost of counting people has gone up. So, and that applies to 2020 as well, right? So the cost is increasing, and a lot of this depends on is our federal government willing to spend the money to actually get people to be counted. There has always been an undercount in the census. Here we have, I don't know, does anybody know who this person is? No? Okay, so this is before there was Venus and Serena Williams, there was Althea Gibson. She was the first African-American woman to win one of the majors in tennis. If we looked at the 1940 census, she does not appear. They just did not count. She's not in the records, right? So there's always been a problem with the undercount racially. Back in the 1960s, we had maybe even 8% of the African-American population simply not counted. Now, over time, it's gotten better. So estimates of, like, say, the 2000-2010 census, maybe a 2 or 3% undercount for African-Americans or Latinx population. The undercounts affect states because some states are undercounted relative to other states. So we see the dark states here are states that we know were undercounted in 1990, whereas the lighter states they weren't as heavily undercounted as the darker states. It's a lot of the country, and I mean, if you're in Wisconsin or Michigan, great for you, but if you're in Texas or California, not so great in terms of, is the census manipulating your actual numbers? Now, how did this actually affect California in 1990? There was an estimate of, now this is an estimate by the census itself. The census using other records to try to determine what's the accurate count. Now, the census found that over 800,000 people were missing in California for 1990. What did that cost us? It cost us one House seat. It also, that first year, the estimate of the cost by the California Legislative Analysis Office, it cost California $200 million. And that's just 1 year. Since the census is conducted every 10 years, you multiply that loss by 10, and now we're talking $2 billion, right? There's been other studies about what is the effect of census undercounts on federal spending. So I'm citing one that just looked at 5 federal programs that accounted for roughly $300 billion of spending in 2015. The effect of a 1% undercount in 2015 would be that for 37 states, each uncounted person means $1,000 less to that state government in terms of federal funding. So that's 37 states. All right, now I want to wrap up my discussion. Why should we worry about the 2020 census? Overall, we have seen that participation in surveys and census has been becoming more difficult over time. And that could be kind of the same problem we're getting the parable of the coronavirus, right? We are just not getting enough people to participate, and we're not getting correct information. Think about how in 2016, all the polls predicted a Clinton victory, but then someone else won. As Marianna mentioned, this is the first time we are conducting a census with, the first response is going to be online. And we've seen problems with new technology rollouts. We just saw it, with the Iowa caucus. They were going to have all this fancy apps to count the votes, and it turned out to be a boom, right? It got all messed up. So, the number of trials we've had in terms of testing this new census technology has been very limited. So, by the time they start counting in next April, who knows whether it'll look like what happened in Iowa. Finally, trust in government is actually getting worse over time. You can just chart the trend since the 1960s. Fewer and fewer people trust the government. And that is why people are more reluctant to participate in these things that are key to our party planning, right? And the trust question becomes even worse when we try to gain the census by adding things like a citizenship question, which, we know from leaked documents that some Republican strategists said, let's add this citizenship question so that, we will discourage certain people from trying to participate. Now, the Supreme Court has already ruled they can't use the citizenship question, but the damage may have already been done because they know that's the intent of the current, government in power, and they may wonder, well, this president has been getting away with other stuff, maybe they'll do something else, right? So there are lots of reasons to worry about the implementation of this next round of the census. And again, if we just remember the parable of the coronavirus, who knows what damaging effects it could have on our overall general public policy.
Speaking of technical issues here. If you wouldn't mind, I would appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. You came all this way. Hi. I think this mic is working. First, I want to really thank my panelists here. I really appreciated that they agreed to come and be part of this. And I'm just wowed by all the things that they put together. And I'm glad that this is being live streamed and archived so other people can learn from this. Because, excuse me, here as I make noises to get up here. One of the things that I was asked when I first proposed a census panel was people said, well, what does that have to do with social justice? And I think that it's pretty clear what it has to do with social justice. From the comments we've had already, it's not only a critical part of who gets what, I mean, literally divvying up resources, but it's also, and I'm going to argue too, it's the basis for so much, including the ways we are perceived and the ways we perceive ourselves. And I'm thinking about the Mina question. So let me see here. This always happens when you have. Now is that full screen up there? I can't see what's full screen up there. Okay, let's see. Okay, oops, all right. I think I went. What is the census? trying to get back to the, so the census we know is something that is, trying to get back here. Let's see what it is. Okay, there, what is the census? As my fellow panelists have already said, the census is something that is specified in the US Constitution. And one of the things that is interesting about the census to me from a methodological perspective, which I come to from having taught research methods for 24 years, and I actually love teaching research methods, which is a good thing if you're happen to be one of my students, but is that it is not something where you can use sampling. And so one of the things that you usually try to do if you're trying to count something about a population or get their opinions about something, like their opinions about a new proposed law in California or in the United States or something, is you realize you don't have to have the whole population. You can get a sample, and if you've done it appropriately, with lovely representative sampling guidelines, then you don't need to count the whole population. But that is not true with the census. You have to count everybody because the Constitution says so, and the Supreme Court has said, yep, you're gonna count everybody. Because there were, and I think there still are efforts, you may be able to say something about it. There may still be efforts to say, look, we want to avoid an undercount. We want to have the most accurate count. Let's use modern, very sophisticated sampling strategies that are used routinely for things like, from my little area of the world, the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is something that criminologists and criminal justice folks, as well as policy developers in the area of crime and criminal justice response, use a lot. And it is a yearly sample of 52,000 households that estimates. It's a sample of the entire country. But no, you cannot do that. The original intent of the Constitution is to enumerate every single person with that crucial 3/5 compromise that was in earlier censuses. And of course, now we count every single person. We try to. So we're struggling with this. We've got this need and this legal mandate to count every single person, including folks who are not citizens, including people who are just born, including people who are incarcerated. But we cannot use sampling to do that. Now that's different from the fact that the census data is used to make estimations about a huge variety of things. So you can use census data to make probability estimates, but you can't use it to actually conduct a count. And so we're in this position where we're trying this huge variety of strategies, as my fellow panelists have already discussed, to try and get an accurate count, including, let's see if I get, my understanding is, for example, in New York, they're sending out people who are linguistically and culturally competent to go to all of the boroughs and to go to those multi-story apartment buildings and to knock on the door and say, you know, in Spanish, or sometimes in other languages, say, hey, this is who I am, this is this thing you got in the mail or in your online inbox. It's the census. This is why you need to fill it out. Do you have any questions about this? And no, the government isn't going to use the data. It's the trust issue. They're not going to use the data to tax you more or to report about that job you're looking into the table, or to deport you, or to tell your landlord that you have 2 extra people living there plus 10 cats. It's okay. It's safe. So it is about trusting. And I'm thinking about this as we come up to April 1st. Yes, April 1st is Census Day 2020. I don't know if that's something that will be good or not good for getting an accurate count. Maybe the fellow panelists and I could do an M&M's bet. Is that going to make the count better or worse because it's on April Fool's Day? But at any rate, so we know we cannot use an estimate. Although Of course, how do we know when a census is an undercount or an overcount? And usually an undercount is the problem, but an undercount relative to some places or groups can be overcount. Because, as has been said before, the census people and others who are interested in accuracy are using other data like county statistics and licenses from the DMV and a million other sources of data that say, oh, we didn't count Althea. We didn't count enough people. This is what's going on. And one of the things I notice from the perspective of accuracy is that some of the things we're trying can help us to be more accurate, but they can also bring confusion. And each panelist has touched upon that a little bit, but I wanted to add in that one of the things I noticed is, okay, once again, the census is asking me to report myself and everybody in my household who usually stays sleeps at this place as of April 1st, 2020, in terms of gender. But we have two choices. The census gives us two choices. For those of you who may not have this on your radar screens, which I'm assuming is a lot of people, because some of us pay more attention to this than others, in California last year, it became possible for me to report my gender to the DMV on my driver's license as female or male or simply an X. I do not consider myself either female or male. Perhaps I consider myself neither. Perhaps I consider myself a combination of both. I now have a legal right to be represented on my driver's license as an X. So when I look at the attempts to make the census more welcoming to everybody, more descriptive of everybody, I'm like, okay, we're just stuck there with the male, female. There's not even another category. Like, really? Okay, so from the perspective of someone who's taught methods for more years than most of my students have been alive, and who's looking at this and thinking about social justice, okay, what's up with that? I do not have the answer for that. And I think it's something, meaning I think it could be both a methodological issue and perhaps a political issue. And I suspect it's probably both. And so that's something to find out about. Okay, let me see if I can get, I am not a good poker of touchpad mouses. Okay. So as has already been discussed, there are several ways that the census is being conducted, and especially online. We'll see how that rolls out. We'll see. But again, I'm very glad that there are snail mail follow-ups and that there are actual in-person census takers, because the digital divide is a real thing. There are people who do not have access to the internet, far more than you think. My 15-year-old son the other day said, oh, doesn't everybody have access to the internet in America? And I said, no, not necessarily. There's data that shows that there's a lack. Also, as has been mentioned before in this presentation, there are certainly obstacles. One of them are people who frequently, students are undercounted in the census. You know, people who are sofa surfing, people who are in shelters, people who live in group homes and things like that. They're supposed to be counted. Certainly people who are homeless. And so the census has a number of ways of deploying people to try and count homeless folks. And hopefully that will give us the best estimate we can. Still, it's going to be an undercount. We know it's going to be an undercount. And then there are the people who don't want to be counted, either because they're afraid. That's certainly, I think we're all concerned that the fact that there was a lot of press about a possible citizenship question on the census, although thank goodness there is not a citizenship question on the census, but the damage may have been done. But also people, and this is, I won't go into, I decided not to go into a little bit of the dark history of anti-government militia groups. But the truth is, there are people who do not like government, do not trust the government. and they really do not want to be counted by census. And we saw them in the 2010 census, some of them. Some of them stated outright that they didn't want it to be counted. They made public statements. Others of them caused trouble for census takers. And so census takers needed to go in pairs to these places where you had anti-government militia types that said, okay, we don't consider the government of the United States legitimate. These are also the people that tend to be on the FBI's watch list because they do things like get involved in shootouts against government agents and anybody they don't like. So there is, of course, a problem with the count that way. See, okay. And so census plans for homeless count, for example, splitting up between 3 days, and I think one of you had this here, but it's ironic because here we are sitting at this nice table on this lovely stage, and we can't actually see our colleagues' presentations from the side. But so splitting it up for 3 different days, especially hitting people who are in shelters, who are in soup kitchens and stuff, counting people who are non-sheltered, outdoor locations such as tent encampments and on the streets. And one of the things that would also be important to consider here is that, especially in areas, in states such as California, and in areas of states where it's expensive to live, you will find people living at state and federal campgrounds. They'll live there for as long as they can. For example, 3 weeks is the limit. And that's where they have to live, and then they'll move to the next place. So we have to consider, are we actually getting an adequate count of people who are living down, for example, at Half Moon Bay? It's a pretty common thing in the Half Moon Bay State Campground. You'll see people, and sometimes you can tell because they have their clothesline strung up between their tent and a nearby tree. And you talk to them, it's like they're living there because that's the place they can afford to live. To make sure that they get counted. So there are lots of things being done to try and address that, but still perhaps an undercount. I'm afraid I'm going to be breaking the computer here. Okay, maybe I should just, okay, it's that. I don't have any fingernails, that's probably. This has also been touched on. Why do people try to avoid being counted, other than the last thing that I said, that people are actively anti-government? Well, this is directly from the census site. They talk about people having fear of repercussions, concerns about the privacy and confidentiality of the data, and that's where I think that things like the NALEO assurance that we're going to really be holding the census accountable for keeping the data safe is critically important. And they're trusted people, those teachers, those professors. Is the data safe? Okay, but also just apathy. I'm probably putting it less nicely than some of my fellow panelists here said. People feeling like, I just don't give a thing about this, it doesn't matter, I don't care, it doesn't benefit me personally. That's one of the themes that the census found when looking at why people didn't engage in 2010. They're like, yeah, I don't care about it. And I think that we need to make sure that everybody knows the reasons that it matters, that you're not going to get your share of the pie, your spot is not going to get your share of the pie. Of those infrastructure funds and such, if you don't, it's resource distribution. If you don't participate, hundreds and hundreds of federal programs. But the second part that I wanted to touch on, which people have already touched on a bit, is that I think the census is a social justice issue because it's a basic issue. We need the numbers. We need the numbers to, for example, calculate where new businesses are. We need the numbers to calculate crime rates, uniform crime reports. Every state, every county reports crime rates per 100,000 people. Well, there was 1 year when Santa Clara County dipped below 100,000 people, according to census figures. So guess what? That affected how crime rates were calculated for Santa Clara County, which in turn affected things like apportionment of resources to judges, prosecutors, public defenders, police departments. But it also meant that if you were looking for crime data there, you weren't going to get the most accurate thing has votes. It wasn't calculated in the same way as crime rates were calculated for other areas that have more than 100,000 people according to the census. And it gets to that urban and poor, urban and rural power divide too, because to just expand a little bit on what I think Willie said, one of the things that is odd about incarceration and the fact that we've long been, for the last 20 years, been on an incarceration binge in this country, which we are slowly but surely backing away from under federal court mandate to deinstitutionalize and have fewer prisoners, is that some states, such as Alaska, most Alaskan state prisoners are actually not housed in Alaska. They're in Arizona in private prisons. So, okay then, who's getting the resources and who's not getting the resources for that? But it also affects the way people are perceived and whether they feel seen or invisible. And I don't know if this is going to work here. It worked, of course, when we got it together, but we'll see about that. Any suggestions? Keep poking me, the arrow key, okay, which is, okay, can someone show me, okay. Oops, no, I'm trying to get that I'm trying to get it to play. Let's see, so, okay, you want to continue? Yes, I think it's an unexpected error. Okay, rats, it happens. And see, okay, I'm gonna fill it. Okay, all right. I'm so used to using a mouse instead of a touchpad. Okay, so what you're not going to get to see, but what you can probably see, because it's just from last week, I was swapping this out from something else I had here, is a 3-minute clip of Representative Rashida Tlaib talking to the head of the census about why the MENA question that Marianna was talking about earlier. The MENA, how do we say it? Not question, but the MENA category on the census. The Middle Eastern North African, so MENA, that's MENA. Why was it approved? It went through the proper processes and procedures to be approved to be part of the 2020 census, so that people like Rashida Tlaib could be happy with a box that they could check to represent who they are, and yet, oops, it's not on the 2020 census. And the director of the census being asked during a congressional hearing by Congresswoman Tlaib, she says, "Do I look white to you?" And he's like, well, you know, whoever you think you are, we're good with that, we're okay. And she spoke, why isn't this part of the 2020 census? And he says, well, we have a box. You can check other. And I have to say, I wish I could show you this 3 or 4 minutes with Rashida Tlaib, because she says, this is not, no, checking a box other. And it goes back to what my fellow panelists were saying here. There's a huge group of us others out there, right? My kid, who is both bicultural, will probably be one of them for the census and the next census. You know, no, we need to have categories that are more descriptive of who we feel we are. And so when Rashida Tlaib asked the census director what could be done, why it was not going to be on the 2020 census, he says, well, it'll be ready for the 2030 census. She rightly says this is not okay. This is not something, and that I would suggest to everybody here is not a methodological issue, although it will have methodological impacts. It's a political issue. And so we're in the position where we're trying to convince people to take the census that it shouldn't be a political issue, that it won't be used in an inappropriate way, and yet we're seeing that in some ways, whether it's the old slave states compromise in the 1790 census to count 3/5 of a slave as a person, or whether it's failing to have MENA on the 2020 census, there are definitely social justice and feeling felt, feeling seen, or as Rashida Tlaib said, feeling invisible. Because these are the census choices currently. What is person one's race? And it gets asked for everybody in the household that you're filling out the form for. Mark one or more boxes and print origins. White, black, or African American. American Indian or Alaska Native. Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, other Asian, Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Chamorro, other Pacific Islander, some other race. Okay then, so Mina didn't make it in there, and in fact, it's interesting because some members of my own family will have to figure out, are they going to put other Asian or Asian in? They're Pakistani, so we'll see how that goes in the Pakistani community. Methodologically, that's interesting. There'll be wishy categories there. But so it's just something to think about, and also to think about how the census is changing, and the way I try to explain it to my students who are captive audience in research methods, criminology, criminal justice studies, because we make them take it. Sociology makes them take it too, right? They don't get out of that. Pauls makes them take it, maybe, and yeah, I think every department makes you take research methods, but I think census data is like a big, gigantic, independent variable. Census is the way we quantify and operationalize these questions we have about who you are, where you're living, what you're doing, and it determines many dependent variables. So it's a very, very, whether you want to participate or not, it's going to affect you. It's just kind of like voting. It's going to affect you, whether you choose to vote or not, whether you're able to vote or not. Not everybody is able to vote, eligible to vote legally. If you have a felony record and have your voting rights restored, if you're not a citizen, those sorts of things. But voting is going to affect everybody. The census is going to affect everybody. And I will end with a question and a thought here. The thought is to be, I'm obviously also a big, rah-rah, do the census because it's very important. And so the thought is to ask people why they are hesitant about the census. If you know someone who's hesitant about the census, ask them why. Tell them to go and find information, to go to places like NALEO, to go to the census.gov and see what they can find out. Tell them to ask someone to find out information. And so that's the thought. The question is, would you believe that at one point, and it wasn't too long ago, the census asked questions about people's pets? And I know this, and this is, you will have to trust me that, that I'm being honest. I can send the link to anybody who is interested. But the census sometimes gets information wrong, because there was a case of a couple who very, very much was interested in filling out the census. This was actually about 7 or 8 years ago. And they filled out the census because they realized it's their civic duty, and they filled out every question, including a question about whether they had kids. They did not, or whether they had other family members. They did. They considered their cat Sal, a short-haired gray tabby, to be a family member, so they wrote his name down, Sal Esposito, because it was the Esposito family. Guess how surprised they were when they got a jury summons for Sal, the cat. And they told the courthouse, but Sal is not actually a human being. He's a member of our family, but he's a short-haired gray tabby. The judge said, well, how did that come up? How did he get? So it was traced back, and the jury service managers, because one of the things I study is juries. It wasn't in my bio because I was a silly person and didn't send it my bio. So it was the census data had reported that Sal was an actual human being. So the Esposito family had to take their darling, beloved tabby down to the courthouse in a cat carrier and say, see, here's Sal, and he really isn't a person, so he can't serve jury duty. And it made me think about how important accurate census data is. And with that thought, I will end my presentation. Do the census and encourage everybody else to do the census. Everybody except your cat, that is. Thank you. But I'd like to ask if we have any questions. It's really true. I can send you the link. I use it when I teach research methods to talk about accuracy and counting. Because, yeah, there's a little picture of Sal and his cat carrier because the judge wasn't happy to get it. I wonder how many other people on the census are actually not people. I mean, fur babies is a thing now, right? I mean, it wasn't a phrase before 7 or 8 years ago when Sal Esposito, the tabby, was being reported. But too many people, I think of their animals as their children, which is great. But I'm saying it's too many if they're going to start getting counted in the census or. Yeah, and I don't know because you don't have a mic back there to get it, but you're picking up that yes, it's important that we all, each one of us, mention that there is no citizenship question. So not to be afraid of that. There actually was one in the 1950s, I believe, for a little bit. But then they said no, we don't need to do that. And most recently, it's been challenged. This administration wanted to put it there, and we fought back. And so there is no such question. So yes, that's a key thing to think. And no one should be afraid of being counted. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to end show.
It's 10 minutes.